So I'm going to be honest with you. This has been a really, really hard week, just this past week. I told you last week that this series has really chewed on me. I hope it's chewed on you because there's a lot of tension that's brought up when we start looking at kingdom culture, which is what Jesus describes in the Beatitudes. He describes what it looks like for a person to live as a citizen of the kingdom. He describes what characteristics and what way a person carries themselves if they are to be present in God's kingdom. In order to receive God's blessing, this is the type of person you're supposed to be. And as you read through those, you look at those and you realize that is not who I am. In fact, it's almost impossible for me to be that type of person. And as I was digging into the verse for this week, Matthew 5, verse 9, we're going to read it early here. God blesses those who work for peace, for they will be called children of God. That's a really stinking hard thing to do. We live in a culture of conflict, right? We live in a culture where you have to put your walls up every time you walk out of the door because someone's out to get you. And whether that's victim mentality of you not being able to step out of yourself or the truth of your life, because whatever position you hold, your title, the walls you've built up, the relationships you've damaged, that's where we're at. We live in a culture of conflict. It's unavoidable. And it's impossible to live in this culture that thrives on conflict and not have it affect you deeply in some way. If there's one thing we've learned looking at the Beatitudes is that there's a conflict within us between who God calls us to be and the reality of how we live. There's conflict within us of our sinful nature of who we are innately being and who God calls us to be. Conflict is tied to our identity as humans. It's who we are, and we don't hide from it. You can't walk into a bookstore or scroll Facebook without tripping and falling into some self-help book or meme or Facebook post that's got, bullet points that are like, healthy conflict, how to engage with the other side. Right? And it's everywhere. How to engage with people who disagree with you, how to navigate contentious relationships. It's everywhere. We don't hide from it, which is good. We need to acknowledge the conflict in our life because if we bury it, right, it grows. But we've gotten to the point where we justify it. You can't open a history book or watch a documentary that doesn't talk about the wars of humanity, the economic disparity, racial tensions, natural disasters, without there being some silver lining that's trying to whitewash what's really going on. Without the Cold War, we wouldn't have landed on the moon. And there was no desire to go until the Russians said, we want to do it. Without World War II, we wouldn't have gotten out of the Great Depression. I mean, it was horrible. Millions of people died, but we got out of the Depression. Race riots brought conversations regarding racial inequalities into the mainstream. Terrible, terrible things, but good dialogue was happening in the middle of the mess, right? In times of high conflict, when chaos is inescapable, we run to religion. It's statistically trackable. Church attendance, religion participation increases in moments of high conflict. In the middle of the Cold War, church attendance went up. After the terrorist attacks of 9/11, church attendance went up. Oddly enough, during the pandemic, when we weren't able to be together, there was a greater interest in spirituality and faith. It's hard to track church attendance through 2019 and 2020, but what we can see is an increase in people's desire to connect to a higher power. There was a greater awareness of our authority over our lives, and we're seeking that greater authority, right? Where can we find peace in the middle of this chaos? And this chaos isn't new. As much as we like to pretend it is, as much as we open up headlines or get on our phones and we look at this and go, this is just getting worse and worse, none of it's new. Human history is littered with conflict. It didn't start in 1776. It didn't start when presidential elections started hitting social media. Jesus addresses conflict over and over and over again in his earthly ministry because the culture of the kingdom is a culture of peace. And Jesus invites us through him to be citizens of the kingdom. Matthew 5:9, God blesses those who work for peace, for they will be called children of God. Like I said, this was a really hard week for me personally. And I'm going to take this opportunity where I get to stand in front of all of you to share a little bit about it. This conflict we face is inescapable. This first part of this week, I try to, when I'm preaching, dig into the Word a little bit on Monday, right? Just let it sit and pray and meditate on it. But that wasn't possible because this past week was the midterm for school for me. I'm in seminary right now, and this past week was midterm, which means one class ends, next week another class begins, and at the end of a class, you have to write a paper. And on Thursday, a 15-page paper was due, and I hadn't really done much. I wasn't ready for it, if I'm being honest. It was a lot. And as you're writing this, right, as you're writing, I don't know if you remember writing papers, if you've written anything recently, the whole time you write something like, this is garbage, delete and keep typing, delete and keep typing, delete and keep typing, and I can't get over that. I almost failed English in freshman year because my teacher kept saying, I want a rough draft, and I don't write rough drafts. That sounds arrogant, and it's not meant to be because I'm so self-critical. In the moment, I edit the paper. There isn't a rough draft. What is there is what is there. So it takes forever to get through something. So then we get that 15-page paper turned in, right? And I'm like, well, now I got to write a sermon for Sunday. And this is Friday morning. So I open up the Bible, and I turn to Matthew 5, verse 9, and I read, God blesses those who work for peace, for they will be called the children of God. And I'm like, great, I know where I'm going with this, right? Where do we see peace in Scripture? Well, it's right there in Genesis 1:1. God enters into creation. He creates everything. It says it in Scripture, everything's a mess. And then God's presence is hovering over the waters. And what happens next? Anyone? What happens after God creates everything and his presence is hovering over the waters? What is that next thing that happens? Someone has to know this. He speaks. God speaks. And order is brought to the chaos. I'm like, I've got this, right? So Saturday morning, by the time Saturday morning arrives, I've got 4 pages of a theological breakdown of just Genesis 1:1. I'm like, this is where we're going with this. It's 11:30 on Saturday. This is yesterday. 11:30 yesterday. And I'm reading through this, and I'm like, this isn't clicking. I'm really struggling. How are we going to bring this to fruition? And all of a sudden, I had this moment where God goes, this is of you. This isn't of me. Get rid of it. It's 11:30, the day before I'm supposed to preach, and I couldn't get over myself. There's this weird part of this verse that as I was digging into, I just couldn't get past. So I did a word study, and peace, what we translate as peace, is the Hebrew word shalom. Right? And we've heard that one before. It's kind of in our culture a little bit when shalom be to you, right? As we dig into that word shalom, we find there's a greater depth to that word than what we think of when we hear peace. Shalom reaches to the deepest parts of our being. Shalom is the highest good a person can do. Shalom is the highest good a person can do. This is where the inner work of peace, the work of the Spirit in our hearts, pours into our actions. It's the work of discipleship. Matthew 22, verses 36 through 40, Teacher, which is the most important commandment of the law? Jesus says, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all of the commandments of the prophets are based on these two commandments. There's this duality here in these two commandments that bring us into this conflict with peace. When we start to think about how to work for peace, we start to put our feet into action. We have to reckon with that inner turmoil of our hearts, right? We got to find some common ground, because if there's conflict within us, conflict pours out of us. We have to find peace. It begins with loving God. Then love your neighbor. It's that easy, right? Like I said, yesterday I was writing and churning through this, and then all of a sudden I was like, this has got to be gone. And I sat there and I was working and working and working, and it felt like I was banging my head against the wall. And the more I meditated on this word shalom, the harder it got for me to reckon with that inner piece of myself. Because shalom is the highest good a person can do. And it's hard to take a Hebrew word and put it into English, because we don't get like a 5-word definition. Shalom, what we translate to peace, speaks to something that is highly complex, with lots of pieces, but is in a state of completeness. Can you look at your life and say, I'm in shalom? And all the complexities and the mess and everything going on, are you in a state of completeness? As I thought about this word, it took me back to my, when I was younger. I say childhood, and some people are going to laugh, but when I was younger, and Lego sets. Anyone like Legos? I loved Legos. So many. Every Christmas to this day is a Lego set. I have a Darth Vader bust in my office at work that was a Lego present last Christmas. And this may surprise some of you, maybe not others. My Legos in my bedroom were organized in those plastic collapsible tackle box kits where you can put dividers in and separate each Lego piece. If I had a Lego bin that was just all the pieces dumped in, there was something mentally wrong with me. It had to be organized. It's still that way, actually. There's drawers that have each of these individual, by piece, by type, by color, all organized, so I know exactly where to go to get what piece. It makes doing the task, following the instructions of the Lego set, way easier when it's all organized and you know what you're getting, right? Now, I could not put together a Lego set unless every piece that I was supposed to use was there. If it wasn't, we're not building that today. Even if it was the last piece, it was the final flagpole on the top of the Lego set, the whole thing needs to be ruined. It's not complete. You can't have the Statue of Liberty and have the flame be blue. It's not blue, it's yellow, right? Scrap it. We'll start again. We'll have to get a new one. And oddly enough, the more you use Legos, the more you use the pieces, the more damage they get. That's the nature of toys. And inevitably, the more you use Lego pieces, the harder and harder it is to get them to either click together or stay together, because they get worn. They get dinged up, they get dirty, the dog chews on them, you've chewed on them, something has happened, and they won't click together. And what you started out with hundreds of Lego sets perfectly together, by the time you looked at it, there's a bunch of holes in these what are supposed to be complete pictures. What's the point in having any of them then? Trash them. Tear them apart. I've got bins and bins of Lego pieces at my parents' house. Because if I look at any one of them put together, it's incomplete. Shalom is the embodiment of completeness in a chaotic and messy world. We live in a culture of conflict. We live in a broken world. It's unavoidable, and it's impossible for you not to have that conflict stay in your life. So how do we work for peace in a culture that seeks conflict? It's hard not to go into every conversation with your walls up. It's hard not to look in the mirror and start to throw pieces of yourself out because those are incomplete, those are messy, those don't fit with who I want to be. Those don't fit with who I'm called to be, so we're going to push them to the side. And we're about to walk into a season of high conflict. In case you weren't aware, we're about 2 months out from entering a presidential election year. I think I heard someone's stomach churn. I know I'm fighting off stress hives already because Thanksgiving's right around the corner. Campaign ads everywhere, targeted social media influencing, and if 2020 was bad, I can't imagine what 2024 is going to be like. And in the middle of this chaos, in the middle of the conflict, Christians are called to work for peace. What does that even look like in the mess of our lives? When we have to look at ourselves and go, I'm not at peace. How can I have the audacity to walk forward and work for peace? I think it can be tempting to see peace as silence. I mean, we use those two words together all the time. I just want some peace and quiet. I love my children to death, but I sat on the couch yesterday thinking I would give anything for some peace and quiet. I mean, how do you love your neighbors when we're looking for peace and quiet? How do you love your family? I can give my wife a spa day where she can spend time away from me and the kids and she can find some peace and quiet. How do you love your coworkers? Well, I can do my job as well as I can. I can help them do their job. So when we all start looking at our tasks, we can find peace and quiet in those moments where, okay, the job has been done. How do you love family members who you've had to mute on Facebook because of their rants? Well, I muted them. That's how I love them. Now, when I see them, I'm not going to be angry at them for the last thing they said. And if they start to talk too loud, I'm going to leave. I'm going to find some peace and quiet. Jesus says, blessed are those who work for peace. Blessed are those who work for shalom. And shalom is something that is complex with lots of pieces, but it's in a state of completeness. It's in a state of wholeness. How do we work for shalom? If we really look at that word and we meditate on it in our hearts, the tension we come to, the shalom Jesus calls us to work for, to embody, is not the absence of conflict. It's the pursuit of wholeness. You see, conflict, the opposite of conflict says, you sit over here, I'll sit over here, and that way we don't fight. We're at peace. We just won't look at each other. And if we've got something to say, we'll send someone else in between. That's not the peace God calls us to embody. That's not the peace of the kingdom. Shalom is to make complete. It's to restore. God blesses those who work for peace, for they will be called children of God. Jesus invites us into this counterculture movement of a broken world, out of the conflict, and to be agents of restoration. The peace Jesus calls us for is to live not simply to stop fighting, not to live a life of not fighting, but to live a life of restoration, to restore relationships, to live with one another, to start working for one another. Now talk about a radical counterculture movement. Who in your life is there conflict with that you're like, I'm going to go work for that person. I'm going to help them achieve what it is they need to achieve. What does working for peace look like in your life? What conflicts are you burying? What are you avoiding? All for the sake of peace. Jesus teaches us what restoration looks like in the face of conflict. And he does it in this radical, world-changing way. Matthew 26, beginning on verse 20. It was evening, and Jesus sat down at the table with the 12. And while they were eating, he said, I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me. Well, greatly distressed, each one of them asked in turn, Am I the one, Lord? And he replied, "One of you who has just eaten from this bowl will betray me, for the Son of Man must die, as the Scriptures declared long ago. But how terrible it will be for the one who betrays him, for it would be far better if that man had never been born." Then Judas, who would betray him, also asked, "Rabbi, am I the one?" And Jesus said, "You have said it." Every time I read this passage, I can't help but feel the discomfort in that moment, right? There's some serious tension going on. Jesus sits there with his friends and says, "One of you has condemned me to death. One of you has gone behind my back, turned me over, and I'm going to suffer and die because of your actions." None of them know who it is except one person. And he has to just sit there. And then I can't imagine he asks this very loudly, right? Because he knows his guilt. He's probably waited until everyone else has asked, and he's probably now waiting until the noise picks up a little bit so he can go, "Jesus, is it me?" Well, you've said it. Jesus looks right in his eyes and says, "I know what you did. I know what you did to me." Now, Jesus doesn't seek retribution. He doesn't tell Judas to leave. He doesn't give Judas the silent treatment, right? He still talks to Judas. What Jesus does is something completely crazy, something that I know I wouldn't have the character to do if I knew someone did what Judas did to me. What Jesus does next changes the course of human history. Jesus took some bread and blessed it, and he broke it in pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, "Take this and eat, for this is my body." He took the cup of wine and gave thanks to God for it. He gave it to them and said, "Each of you drink, for this is my blood, which confirms the covenant between God and his people. It is poured out for the sacrifice to forgive many for sins." So Jesus shares a path of restoration. In the mess of everything, as Jesus sits there at the table with his disciples, when we think of that picture in our minds, we see a complete picture, but in reality, there were Lego pieces missing out of it. Big, gaping holes in this last meal Jesus sought to share with his friends. And Judas sat there and stared at Jesus with this inner conflict, this turmoil, this incompleteness in his heart. And Jesus washes over him and says, "This is how to be restored." Who is it in your life that you need to sit down and break bread with? Who needs to experience the love of Jesus through you? How is Christ leading you forward in a path of restoration? What restoration looks like for each of us is different. Some of us may not be ready or able to sit down with those people in our lives who have wounded us, or maybe we've caused such deep wounds in others that we aren't willing to come to the table. But our work for peace isn't reliant upon the response of others. When we look at the broken relationships of our lives, when we look at the brokenness within ourselves, all of those parts we want to cast into the bin because in our eyes they're not worth trying to rebuild. The work of wholeness isn't our responsibility, but it is a response of your heart. God blesses those who work for peace, and the work of peace begins in the heart. We live in a culture of conflict. We live in a culture of brokenness that is sloughed off onto us. And as we look at the culture of God's kingdom, in us it reveals that brokenness. Those pieces that we have rejected, that don't quite fit right anymore, that are damaged, that are too loose to stay in place, that have bite marks in them from where we've, out of frustration, chewed on pieces, trying to get other pieces to fit together. And Jesus still calls us in the middle of that mess to work for wholeness and restoration. Matthew 11, verse 28. And Jesus said, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle of heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light. You see, Jesus invites you to the table. He looks at you with all of your missing pieces and says, I know who you are, I know what you've done, and I love you. Jesus calls us to shalom. In the complexity of our mess, Jesus invites us to the table, and he makes us whole. Those pieces that are missing, the ones that we've rejected, he fills in the gap. I'd like to invite the singers to come back up. In Jesus, we have a path toward restoration, to find God, to be reunited in the mess. But the work of peace doesn't end in our wholeness. If you notice, when Christ says, take on my burden, when he says, come to me all who are weary, he follows that with, take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you. The work of peace comes through the pursuit of loving restoration. When we find ourselves sitting in our mess, trying to fix all of the parts of our life after we've put all of this energy and time into something that we know just isn't working, and we feel like we're bashing our head against the wall, when our life feels like it's not going forward, Christ doesn't call us to toss it away. He calls us to be rebuilt in him and to rebuild those relationships of our lives that have become so broken that we don't recognize them anymore, through his peace, through his wholeness, through his shalom. Because peace is not an avoidance of conflict. It's not a sidestepping of disagreement. In those moments of our lives where we don't like who we've become, we don't like who our family has turned into, those relationships we have that have turned away from who we think they should be, Christ calls us to work for wholeness in love. So how is the Spirit prompting you to be an agent of restoration in the middle of brokenness? How is the Spirit of God leading you forward in wholeness? Not just in peace, but completeness. Is the voice of God beckoning you closer to him? Is he leading you towards someone who you see as broken, and only the love that lives within you can repair? Are you willing to let him mend the scars of your heart so you no longer have to operate out of brokenness, but out of the fullness of his love? Paul writes to the church in Colossia. Colossians 3, beginning on verse 15, so let the peace that comes from Christ rule in your hearts. For as members of one body, you were called to live in peace, and always be thankful. Let the message about Christ in all its richness live in your lives. Teach and counsel others with all of the wisdom he gives. Sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs to God with thankful hearts. And whatever you do or say, do it as a representative of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to him, God the Father. Heavenly Father, we ask that your Spirit be with us this morning. Shine a light on those places of our lives where we've allowed brokenness to determine our judgment and cast things aside. Shine a light in our hearts this morning in those areas of brokenness where you have walked in and you filled the gap and you were the missing piece. Father, we ask that this morning your presence fill those gaps and overflow in our lives so we may be agents of restoration in a broken and hurting world. Amen.